All righty, why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is John Gershman. I teach at the Wagner School and would like to thank everyone for attending on behalf of the co-sponsors of the Conflict, Security, and Development Series, the Office of International Programs at Wagner, the graduate, excuse me, the Masters in International Relations program at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, the Center for Global Affairs, at NYU School of Professional Studies, the International Education Program at the Steinhardt School, the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice, and the Bernstein Institute for Human Rights, both at NYU's Law School. We're very excited today to have Michael Kimmage, who is the author of the forthcoming book, Collisions, The Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability. As is our previous practice, if people have questions as we go, feel free to throw them into the Q&A box. And if you forget, go ahead and throw them into the chat box. Michael's going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll move to a Q&A session. So without further ado, Michael.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, John, for the introduction, and thank you so much to Hannah Atchison for helping to make everything possible today. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be among you. I don't want to go on too long, so let me just sketch out the ideas that I'd like to share with you, and then I understand that we can go into a conversation about all of this. And as we approach the second-year anniversary of the war, of course, the book is about events in the past, but it sort of inevitably flows into questions about the present and what may be on the horizon. I wanted to identify the 4 reasons that I outline in the book for the war, the 2022 invasion, that we're going to see the second anniversary of shortly. And then I'd like to identify the consequences that I predict in the book, and we'll conclude with just a few words about where they may be accurate and may be becoming in some ways inaccurate due to things that have happened over the course of the last 8-9 months. The challenge of writing a book on a topic like this is, of course, that it's a moving target, and that it very much continues to move after you finish writing it. So in the book, I look at 4 reasons for the war, and I think some of them are fairly self-evident, but it's good in some ways to begin with the obvious before getting to the more complicated factors that have led to this, in my view, epical event, both for Europe, but I think also for the larger international landscape. The first, and this is of course the most obvious, is that Russia has a strong intent to control Ukraine in some form or fashion. This is historically informed. Russian Empire had portions of Ukraine within it, so too did the Soviet Union. And I think you can see a line that extends from 1991, the years in which Boris Yeltsin was in power, certainly into the Putin presidency, that suggests that rightfully Ukraine should remain in a Russian sphere of influence. Now, this didn't necessarily mean war when Ukraine was compliant with this vision, which at certain points it was. Between 1991 and 2014 or 2022, then war was not so much an inevitability. But when, especially after 2014, Ukraine defied this view and wished to see its future in a transatlantic context and wished to see its future in Europe, then Russia's response was coercion. And you can see the trajectory of that coercion as quite significant in 2014, annexation of Crimea, Russian incursion into eastern Ukraine, and of course, 2022 is the culmination of the trend. So it's a war that begins to a degree in 2022. It begins also, you could say, in 2014, and there's a steady intensification of Russian military activity in and around Ukraine, and that is the primary reason for the war in 2022. Another reason for the war is some of the vulnerability that Ukraine has experienced since achieving its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. Ukraine is a strategically very important place. Both the First World War and the Second World War, in a way, run through Ukraine. And Ukraine, after 1991, is one of the many countries in Europe that falls in a unclear category. It's not an obvious candidate for NATO membership, although it was moving at times in that direction. It's not a part of a Russian alliance structure after 1991. And there's a fair amount of internal upheaval in Ukrainian politics that at times can either create the reality or create the perception of a country that is not as cohesive as it might be. Ukraine also suffers after 1991 from pretty considerable poverty and economic difficulties. And so Ukraine is not a military superpower in and of itself, and it's not a part of any kind of alliance. There's no commitment on the part of the US or of Western European countries to come to Ukraine's defense, and that puts Ukraine in a vulnerable position. So you have a neighbor, this is reason number one, Russia, with an intent to control Ukraine, and then you have a Ukraine that is not perhaps strong enough to push back against that control, or the perception in Moscow is that Ukraine is not strong enough to push back against Moscow's intent to control. Third reason I would put for the origins of this war, and if anybody wishes to ask about NATO expansion and enlargement when we have a chance for conversation, please feel free to do so. That's a part of the picture, but to me, not one of the real reasons for the war. Is the third reason I would put forward is lax diplomacy. And this is on the part of France and Germany, and also on the part of the United States. To characterize this story, I think we need to go back to 2014. You have the annexation of Crimea, and you have Russian soldiers who are stationed in eastern Ukraine. The creation of these two gangster republics, Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic, in the spring and summer of 2014. According to Berlin, Paris, and Washington, London as well, this was an unacceptable development, what Russia had done, and sanctions would have to be put together and a diplomatic process to rid Ukraine of this illegal and intolerable military presence. That's articulated. That's the view of the Obama administration. That's the view of Francois Hollande, who was then the president of France, Angela Merkel, the chancellor of Germany, and is common consensus across the European countries that are members of the NATO alliance. This is put forward. Conditions are set. Conditions are made. Russia does not comply. And what do you get over time? Instead of a hardening of these conditions, a toughening of these conditions, you get a push to normalize, which runs across the Trump and the Biden administrations, is very visible in Germany, which is trying to reconstitute its economic relationship with Russia after 2014, 2015, and is something of a Europe-wide phenomenon. I think that the lax diplomacy in this case suggests that the West didn't really care that much about Ukraine, didn't particularly care about Russia's actions there, was not going to make big sacrifices or make a big move on behalf of Ukraine. And I think that was a signal that was not intentionally sent from the West to Russia, but it was a signal that was received in Russia about Western positions and Western capabilities and Western commitments to Ukraine. So, that lax diplomacy is a subtle factor in some ways because it's not generating crises between 2015 and 2022, but is, to my mind, a very significant background feature of this conflict. And then finally, and here you can kind of make the argument in two ways, but I decide on one particular way, Russian perceptions of the West, meaning Europe and the United States. And you could look at this question in terms of Russian fears of the West, Russian fears that Ukraine would join the West, Russian fears of the growth of the NATO alliance, etc. I do not believe that this is paramount in terms of explaining the war. And so I think I almost invert this explanation in the book and identify a cause of the war as a Russian perception of Western weakness. And here, what's meant by weakness is not that the West is falling apart before 2022, but that it had experienced a set of difficulties and setbacks. This would be January 6th in the United States. This would be the pullout from Afghanistan, sort of after effects of the Iraq War. You could connect this to the third reason about lax diplomacy, but a sense that there is diminishing unity and effectiveness within Western societies and in the foreign policy of the United States and Europe. And so this is a moment in which to strike. This is a good time in which to make a move. This Western weakness might not last forever. It might be sort of move beyond. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union perceived the West to be quite weak, but that didn't last forever then. And so I think that this perception of Western weakness came with a kind of timeline on the Russian side and encouraged Putin to make his move in February of 2022. So intent to control Ukraine, Ukrainian vulnerability is real and imagined, lacks diplomacy, and a perception in Moscow of the West as weak and unable to back up Ukraine. These are, I think, the four reasons that are there. All of them matter, of course, until February 24th, 2022. Then we enter a different world, and that, sets the war down its course. But in terms of explaining Russian motivations or the decision to invade, these four reasons to me seem like the most important ones. Let me jump briefly to a few of the conclusions that the book makes. And as I mentioned a moment ago, I'll sort of revise one of these conclusions or add a new conclusion based on the events of the last 2 years. So I make a couple of predictions in the conclusion of the book, not maybe a wise thing for a historian to do, but nevertheless tempting. And one is that Ukraine will join the West as a result of this war. I do not make predictions about the kind of territorial integrity Ukraine is going to have, whether it's going to be all of Ukrainian territory or some of Ukrainian territory. That I think is too difficult to discern at the moment, but I do think that the war is going to solidify Ukraine's position in Western commercial, legal, military, and political structures. Whether that's NATO membership, EU membership, that too seems very difficult to say at the moment. I'm not sure if that even matters all that much. I think Ukraine will have a place in Europe. What Ukraine did not quite have in 2014, what Ukraine certainly didn't have in the 1990s. And this is going to be one of the most significant consequences of the war. Ironically, it's Russian actions that have driven an outcome that Russia has been for decades, if not centuries, seeking to prevent. A second prediction, would maybe caveat this a little bit more at the present moment than I did when I finished the book, but a second prediction is that this crisis, like the First World War and the Second World War, is going to pull the United States out into the world. That there is something of a natural tendency of the U.S. to look within and to try to avoid and to skirt conflicts that are occurring outside of American borders. That never seems to work. These conflicts come to the U.S. and pull it into the world, as it were. And I do think that the war in Ukraine has had this function. The U.S. wanted to shift attention to Asia and to other places in the first few months of the Biden presidency, and that was an initiative of the Trump presidency as well. In no sense has the U.S. been pulling back from its engagements and commitments in Europe. If anything, in terms of money spent over the last 2 years, never has the U.S. been as robustly involved in Europe, at least in the post-Cold War period, as in the last 2 years. But I think as everybody could guess in terms of where you might challenge this argument, debates in Congress about whether to support Ukraine, the holdup of aid to Ukraine in Congress now that's lasted several months and is starting to have an effect on the battlefield, and a presidential election that's shaping up to be a referendum on whether the U.S. should be committed to Europe and to Ukraine is something to bear in mind at the present moment. So that prediction, I think, is true as far as it goes. It's true until the present moment. We'll see how true it remains. Third prediction I feel very confident about, and this is that there will be a large-scale war in Europe for many, many years, if not for decades to come. The war is starting to go Russia's way at the present moment. It's seesawed for the last 2 years. There have been some really good months for Ukraine, and I don't think that it's going to go Russia's way forever, but that's the tendency of the moment. But Russia is extremely far from anything resembling victory in the war. Russia has not taken a city in Ukraine since the very beginning of the war, and Russia has expended unbelievable amounts of materiel and manpower on taking the city of Bakhmut, which was 70,000 people before the war, and more recently the city or town of Avdiivka, which was 30,000 people before the war. So Russia's making progress, you could say, in its terms, but it's glacial and it's unbelievably costly. And it's clear with the counteroffensive of last summer that didn't really go very far, that Ukraine is not going to be able to terminate the war on its terms in the next few months or probably in the next few years, if at all. So both sides have very much the intent to fight. Neither side is able to finish the fight, and that bodes, sort of ill for a short war. And I think that the ramifications for Europe are going to be exceptionally consequential. whether that's inflation, whether that's the spillover of the conflict into Europe, whether it's migrant flows, other factors, the war is going to continue to destabilize Europe for a long time to come. In some ways, we may have not really seen the destabilization of Europe that the war will bring, because I think the war is still in its earlier stages. Those are the three predictions that I make in the book. And, the first and the third, I think, are pretty solid. Second one, as I mentioned, may be a little bit shaky. The fourth point I'll make, and I'll just sort of conclude on this point here, that I don't think I emphasized quite enough in the book itself, is the radicalism of Russia as an actor, both in Europe, in Ukraine, of course, but also on the global stage. That you have a Russia that is, in its own view, in a state of war with the West, with the United States and Europe, not just with Ukraine. And Russia is using the levers that it has, and it has quite a few, to augment global instability for the sake of not perhaps winning the war, but for the sake of gaining advantage in the war. So obviously the Russian reaction to October 7th, deepening relationship to Iran and to Hamas as part of this, other actors in the Middle East that are very much positioning themselves against Israel and the West. Russia's growing relationship with North Korea is very significant, which seems to be emboldening North Korea to challenge regional order there. Russia's weaponization of grain, which has caused international prices for food to skyrocket, and this too is a tool of Russian foreign policy, of Russian diplomacy, and Russia's refusal to compartmentalize, which of course Moscow would blame on the West, but putting the matter of blame aside is just startling to behold. There is now no arms control between the United States and Russia. There's no way in which, as in the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US kind of fought over here, but then did diplomacy and deal-making over here. That's come to an end. There's none of that going on. There's no positive agenda whatsoever that Russia has for its relations with the West. And this, for the world's second largest, second most important nuclear power, is just a startling circumstance. So Russia is taking the radicalism, the options that it has for radicalization of the international environment. It's pushing those forward. And I think the last 7-8 months have seen Russia making a few gains in that regard. And that, to conclude, is the motif of global instability that I put in the title of the book. So 4 reasons and 4 conclusions. I'll draw to a close there. And of course, I'm very eager to take your questions, and John, to talk through whatever is on your mind as well.
Great, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Michael. That was great. So what I thought we would start, we do have a question from the audience, so I'll start with that. NATO seems to be a U.S. kennel of good dogs that follow U.S. direction, e.g. the invasion of Iraq. Now is Russia a U.S. target to continue the Cold War?
Now is NATO a Russia a U.S. target? Well, thanks for the question. And I think it's a really essential one for the war and for its future consequences. So, 2 points that I would make that don't line up perfectly. But one is that Russia does seem to have, to the extent that we can infer its reading of the world and its motivations, it does seem to have a real fear of NATO, or a real grudging respect or esteem for the NATO alliance. One thing that Russia has not allowed itself to do in the course of the war with Ukraine is to have the war spill over onto the territory of NATO member states. Now, there are a few exceptions to this. There are missiles that have flown into Romania and to Poland, and under certain circumstances, you could imagine a series of accidents that would put Russia in conflict with NATO. But Russia has made efforts on its side not to let things develop in that fashion. Russia has never directly challenged a NATO member state, not in its Soviet form and not in its post-Soviet form. And if we take Russian rhetoric at face value, which you can do with a certain amount of caution, the very anxiety about Ukraine joining NATO is a sign that Russia takes NATO seriously and doesn't want it to be close to Russia and doesn't want it to be a regional factor. So I think that helps us to understand why for Russia, NATO is something that is significant and something that matters and something that Russia can't trifle with. And the war in Ukraine is evidence of that. On the other hand, A lot depends on how things go in the battlefield. This would be my second point about Russia and where it's going to take things. And I think that in Russia's eyes, or in Putin's eyes, the war is starting to break in Russia's direction, that the degree of Western support to Ukraine has been formidable, but maybe not overwhelming, and that there may be possibilities opening up, certainly if Russia would start to make big gains in the war, possibilities opening up not to attack NATO directly or bring the war to NATO, but to start to chip away at the solidity and cohesion of NATO. And so to make what are described as gray zone threats that are, military threats in nature, but are not acts of war, maybe kidnappings, you've seen poisoning of people, sometimes Russian nationals, sometimes British subjects, and others, sort of poisoned, attacked, kidnapped by Russian intelligence on the territory of NATO member states. And I think that the Russian approach in the future will be a kind of divide and conquer. How can Russia use fear within NATO member states or ideological tools to create fissures and divisions within NATO? That's not World War III. But it could be Russian efforts to weaken and to undermine NATO from within. So the esteem is there, but Russia is not entirely passive about the way that it deals with this big structure in Europe that we call the NATO alliance.
I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit just about, now reflecting 2 years after the invasion, that on the one hand, this, as you noted, this was not a surprise. There had already been, the taking and establishment of territory in the East earlier in this century. But what was this and the Russian invasion clearly did not go as the Russians expected. And so I'm curious your sense of that, which is, was this, a colossal intelligence failure, that this did just show the kind of the feet of sand that the Russian military had? In Putin's Russia, is there, the predominance of yes people around, so an unwillingness to acknowledge whatever might have been limits on the capacity of the Russian military to carry out such an operation, fierceness, underestimating the fierceness of Ukrainian resistance? I'm just curious your kind of take on both what seemed to be a strategic miscalculation and kind of what explains why, in your sense, the kind of what seemed to be the Russian expectation that they were going to have a relatively quick victory and, establish some kind of a client regime of some sort, did not come into pass.
Well, thank you so much for the question. I want to break it into two parts. The part that you mentioned when you used the phrase quick victory and why that completely failed on the Russian side. And I think, John, you've already mentioned some of the most important factors, but we'll sort of outline those in a moment. I think the second point is about Russian strategy and where this fits in Russia's view of Ukraine, of Europe, of the world. And there I would be a little bit reluctant to say strategic miscalculation, although it may prove to be that in the end. I think that there's a way in which this is just a Russian strategy, what it's doing in Ukraine, and we can try to understand what it's up to, and it will no doubt take years to assess its effectiveness in Russian terms. From our vantage point outside of Russia, not only does the war seem like a strategic miscalculation, but it's ethically something absolutely horrific, unjustifiable, and just a violation of many basic things that we hold dear. But obviously the Kremlin has a different logic. So intelligence failure, to be sure. Ukraine was badly assessed by Russian intelligence as compliant with a possible Russian invasion, as if the country could either be bought off or lots of people in Ukraine were waiting to be taken into Russia. That didn't prove to be the case. You have corruption within Russian society. That's not a novel point, but it does permeate the military. And so a lot of stuff that was promised that would happen quickly or happen capably didn't happen in that fashion. There's a famous Twitter thread about tires and how the Russian military dealt with tires in the lead up to the invasion. And that's one of the things that really damaged Russia's prospects in the invasion of Kiev. And so you have logistical factors like that made a quick invasion very difficult. And then, more importantly, I think than the internally Russian factors was the willingness of Ukraine to fight, the ways in which from 2014 to 2022, Ukraine built up a very viable military. Certain miscalculations on the Ukrainian side in the immediate lead up to war, but the military has performed well. And you, of course, have the leadership of Zelensky. I think these are all quite familiar features, but this is one of the things that makes it impossible for Russia to mount a quick victory. And having mentioned Russian perception of Western weakness or lack of commitment to Ukraine, in my framing comments, what Russia did not predict and did not contend with was the high level of support that the US and other countries were willing to lend Ukraine, not just after February 24th, 2022, but in the weeks and months before the war. This is intelligence sharing, this is targeting, this is many things that have been important for the war effort. So all of those, I think, fall under the category of Russian misreadings and blunders when it comes to the war. This first point that I mentioned of a Russian will to control Ukraine is, I think, at the core of Russian strategy in the country. And there's a nihilistic side to this, which is that if we can't have it, we are going to wreak as much havoc as possible in Ukraine. And I think that this describes a lot of Russian activities in the first year of the war, where it was really hard to see what Russia was up to, what it was gaining, what it was doing, but it was destroying and making it difficult for Ukraine to export grain and to run its economy and just to function as a normal country. And I think that that was an expression almost of outrage. Well, if they're strong enough to stand up to us and they want to go in this westward direction, we're just going to impose horrific costs. But beyond that, I think is a sense that Russia is entitled to write the rules in this part of Europe. And if it has to do so through military force, so be it. And it will use its international levers and tools to contribute to this effort of writing the rules. And here, I don't think that the war has been such a disappointment for Russia. It's not there yet where they wish it to be. There's a lot of ground for Russia still to cover. But I think that there's a sense that this may, over time, pan out, either because it's so hard for Ukraine to kind of resist the scale of the invasion that continues to be imposed upon Ukraine, and in the Russian assessment because the US is unreliable and Europe may get distracted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this part of it, strategically, let's just say it's up for grabs. Yes, maybe immoral and maybe impossible in the long term for Russia, but something to which the Kremlin is still committed, and that's we do have to acknowledge that.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about thinking about how the invasion has played out both within Europe and within the United States. And I totally agree. I don't think it's played out necessarily the way anyone expected, at least in the US. If you had asked, I think, somebody to put money down that that we would have the US Congress arguing about funding for Ukraine at this moment as a key issue, I don't know that I don't know if I would have taken that bet, prior to the invasion. But I'm just curious, as because the framing of the book is talking about kind of reshaping the globe, right? And that this invasion is in part a marker of this disruption of global systems. How you see that playing out and reflective of, as someone who's also written about US foreign policy and so forth, how you see that altering, I guess the question is, do you see it altering? Is this kind of a critical juncture in kind of the reconfiguration or the ongoing struggles around reconfiguring US foreign policy, arguably ever since the end of the Cold War, and arguments about the appropriate role of the US in the world?
Great. Well, let me start with Europe. And there's no question that the war has consolidated Europe in ways that were hard to imagine before the war. And so we have Finland joining the NATO alliance. We have Sweden on the cusp of doing so. We have levels of military spending. I mean, Germany is the most interesting example, but we have levels of military spending that Europe has not seen since 1945. And I don't think that we're at the middle of this trajectory. I think we're at the beginning of this trajectory. And a paradox, or just a feature of the war, is that the more Russia moves forward when it does, the more that pushes Europe to act and to move in this regard. And so the European Union has made very considerable outlays for military support to Ukraine and a kind of reconstitution of what Europe is because of the war. And there's also been, I think, a huge psychological change in Europe, not all of it to the good, to be sure, but a change where, Europe had been a cognate, a synonym for peace in the 1990s and thereafter. Cooperation, putting these kinds of conflicts into the past, the German-Polish conflicts and the French-German conflicts and the British-German conflicts, all of those were retired. And that was such a wonderful thing about Europe after the end of the Cold War. And I think it's been a huge psychological adjustment to accept that war is now back, a big war is now back, and Europe is going to have to deal with it and to live with it. So all of that stuff is startling, and it's very, very meaningful for the war. It's very meaningful for the kind of Europe that will emerge from this war. But just to add one footnote to that description of a trend, Europe has also been very slow to provide armaments to Ukraine. And a lot of the promises that were made at the beginning of 2023 and 7-8 months ago about ammunition and artillery and all of that, Europe has been dragging its feet. And I think we're starting to see the effects of that. The congressional debates in the US are one thing. US is the most important military supporter of Ukraine, but Europe matters too. And Europe has been strangely lacking in urgency. So all of those things that I described, the kind of psychological, political, military shift, are partial shifts. And Ukraine remains to some degree still sort of distant. And, we'll sort of see where the war takes us in the next couple of months, but that could be the second shock, the shock of the war first and foremost, but then the shock of a war that Ukraine has the potential to lose. For the United States, in some ways, this is a very classic conflict, very, much in line with the history of American diplomacy and the history of American foreign policy. Strong degree of U.S. engagement and involvement in Europe. It's not so surprising in terms of U.S. History going back to the First World War that the Biden administration would describe this war as a conflict between autocracy and democracy is, sort of in tune with how Woodrow Wilson described the First World War and how Franklin Roosevelt understood the Second World War and how most Cold War presidents understood the Cold War. So all of that is kind of familiar. And I think that the way in which the war has sort of activated the U.S. population, a sense of concern and sympathy for the people of Ukraine also resonates with past history. But the war is also in some ways ominous in the case of U.S. involvement in the outside world. And there are lots of storm clouds gathering, whether it be the nature of commitment or whether it be the loss of bipartisanship on the issue of Ukraine, or whether it be something else that, since 2001, since the Iraq War after September 11th, the U.S. has kind of gone out, often with very big rhetorical promises about what it's going to do. It's had middling success and at times failure. I'm thinking here of Afghanistan and Iraq, and then you see a withdrawal. And I don't think it's impossible to apply that framework to Ukraine. Big rhetorical commitments at the beginning and big military and financial commitments, and now you can sort of see the possibility that the United States is going to head for the exit. So that too wouldn't be without precedent, but that's maybe the more recent precedent of big, complicated international conflicts that are out there and in which the U.S. somehow loses interest over time. So the ideological framing is very familiar. This sort of ambiguity of whether the U.S. is in it for the long haul, that I think is the key question, and you can draw on recent precedents to reflect on that.
Great. We have another question from the audience. Despite the blame placed on NATO by Russia in the Ukraine conflict, this seems to contradict the years of NATO-Russia dialogue, which Putin participated in and complied with, until Ukraine took steps to join the European Union and overthrew Yanukovych. In addition, Putin has reacted rather calmly to Finland and Sweden joining NATO, so there seems to be a bit of confusion and contradiction here.
Yes, I am very much in sympathy with the spirit of this question, and I think it's fair to say that perhaps NATO, although it figures in so much of Putin's rhetoric and is very much a part of the Russian narrative of the war, NATO may be a bit of a distraction in this case. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to argue that Russia doesn't care about NATO or is indifferent. Russia is going to create difficulties and headaches for Finland because it joined the alliance. That I'm sure. And there is a lot of real discontent and dislike of NATO, not just in the Kremlin elite, but sort of throughout Russian society. So that's there as a sense of NATO as alien and potentially hostile. And so any Ukrainian move to join the alliance has those echoes in Russia, and that's a part of the story that should be told about the about the war. But as a motivation for the war, as something that really guides and structures Russian policy, I find it very unconvincing. First and foremost, Ukraine has never been on the verge of joining. It's not on the verge of joining today. It's very far from joining the alliance. In fact, the Biden administration has said that Ukraine will not be a member of NATO until the war is over. So that is definitive in some ways. And I think in 2021, 2022, when you have all of this back and forth diplomacy between Russia, US, other countries, when Russia has done the military buildup around Ukraine, seems to be threatening to invade, and is sort of setting all these conditions and making all these demands, I think if Russia had proceeded a bit more calmly, and I think if it had pulled back rather than invading in February 2022, it could have gotten the commitments it was seeking about NATO, that NATO wouldn't go into Ukraine, it wouldn't go into Belarus, it sort of wouldn't go beyond where it already is. And if I'm right about that, and it's not like I have good evidence, I'm just guessing here in a sense, but if I'm right about that, then you really can't say that the war is about NATO, that it has to be about something else. And for that, I would point everybody to Putin's essays about history and civilization, his notion of Ukraine and Russia as one people, and the kind of fantasies he has about fulfilling this reconstitution of the Russian lands. That to me seems closer to Putin's heart than much of what he says about NATO. So in the end, maybe something of a red herring.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm wondering if you would be able to expand on, I know one of your previous books was on kind of the decline of the West as a kind of frame in terms of thinking about US foreign policy. I'm wondering if your sense of, I know it's been an uneven time within Europe at various times talking about the need to develop kind of an independent military force separate from the United States because of either desiring to craft a more autonomous kind of foreign policy or the unreliability of the US. And certainly the reporting of former President Donald Trump's comments about how he seems. So I'm curious, and at the same time, there's a level of military spending, but perhaps the level of actual support being provided directly to Ukraine is not at a scale that one might hope. I'm curious how you see this as reconfiguring just European efforts to say, not that they would blow up NATO, but are they interested in crafting a somewhat more independent, at least within Europe, kind of foreign and military approach?
Well, I think Europe is in a terrible bind in this regard. It will take many, many years for Europe to achieve anything resembling autonomy when it comes to its own defense. And that's, I think, been one of the unambiguous lessons of the war in Ukraine, that when it comes to lots of logistical functions that a modern military needs to perform, there just isn't a substitute for the United States in Europe. It's not that Germany can sub in for that role. It's not that France can do that. It's not that the UK can do that. And obviously the EU itself is not really a military decision-making body, so it can't substitute for what the US provides in this conflict. The intelligence sharing and just the intelligence gathering on the part of the US, which is such a big story in the first few months before, in the months before the war, where obviously the US got a hold of Russian war plans and was able to share them with Ukraine. I don't think that Europe can emulate that and won't be able to emulate that for a long time to come. So in 2016, when Trump, sort of arrived on the scene, when he was elected, there was a huge reconsideration, rethinking in Europe about what the transatlantic alliance was, and then it fell back into the status quo. During Trump, it fell back into the status quo. That's happening again now. It's sort of redux with Trump being once again a candidate and now making somewhat more pointed comments about the obsolescence of NATO and such. And again, it's causing consternation in Europe, but it's very, very hard to move in a different direction, or to move quickly enough in a different direction. And the reason that Europe is also in a bind is that Russia has been radicalized by the war. And now arms are flowing from across Europe into Ukraine. Those arms are being used to kill Russian soldiers. That's not lost on the population of Russia or on the Russian political elite. So Europe is in the war. And if the US does become unreliable, which is possible, Europe is going to be in the position of not having the resources it needs, and yet being deeply implicated and involved in a conflict with a military power like Russia. So I do think that Europe is going to have to navigate around this in a sense, and that means probably hoping that Biden will be reelected. But if he's not, remembering the many confusing aspects of the Trump years. So Trump had all these negative statements about NATO and negative statements about Germany, but during Trump's first term, if that's what it was, two new countries entered NATO, lethal weapons were provided to Ukraine, no deals were struck with Russia. So I think Europe is just going to have to try to push the Trump administration to be as much like that as possible and not to be different. There just isn't an alternative and won't be for a long time to come.
You mentioned briefly the kind of domestic politics within Russia regarding the war, and but now with the death of Alexei Navalny, and kind of curious how you see how this has played out within Russia. I think there were at least some initial hopes from folks in the West that, as the war dragged on and a quick victory didn't happen, that there was potentially going to emerge a more robust anti-war current within Russia, which at least does not, there's clearly a current of folks who are dissidents, but doesn't seem to be significantly, at least from outside, does not seem to be super significant. And I think there were some hopes that, there would be frustration within the military, that there would be some moves to kind of use this as an opportunity to ease out Vladimir Putin as well. And neither of those things really seem to have come to pass. So I'm curious how, both within the Russian populace, but also the Russian political elite, kind of how this has, been, how they have consumed kind of the war.
Yeah, I do think that this is probably the most important variable in the war writ large. The transatlantic story is always one journalistically for the right reasons that's written about as on the edge of breaking apart because there are always these new developments and subtle tensions or not so subtle tensions. I don't think that that's going to happen, even if Trump is reelected. I don't think that that's a variable that's likely to change much. I don't think that Ukrainian morale is going to fall. I think it's been high over the course of the last 2 years, and there are lots of reasons. The war is existential for Ukraine, while Ukraine is not going to change gears and sort of sue for peace or surrender. I could be wrong about those judgments, but I feel a certain degree of confidence in making that these will be the constants of the war, that Ukraine will have a will to fight and Ukraine will have the backing of its transatlantic and other supporters. So the key variable in terms of what's going to change may lie in Russia itself. And if the Russian population were to break from the war, if it were to cause the political demise of Vladimir Putin because of its discontents, the price of the war, if the Russian population judges this to be a strategic blunder and strategic miscalculation, then the war could change fundamentally. That's the thing that could really make the war transformed. If Russia, for internal reasons, goes down a different path. But it's very hard to see evidence for that up until the present moment. And there is the Prigozhin mutiny, which is June of last year, a kind of internal, charismatic figure who ran out of control and sent his mercenaries on a kind of crazy mission to Moscow that lasted for a few hours and was really shocking when it happened. But that's been the only real moment of chaos within Russia during the war. As best as I can understand it, and we work off of very, very incomplete data when it comes to Russian public opinion, a lot of journalism is impossible to practice either for Russians or for others at the present moment because it's been, sort of criminalized. And we all know that Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal has been put in jail for no reason. And so it's very hard for non-Russian journalists to go to Russia and to do real journalism. So we're suffering now from a lack of good information, but this is the best that I can do to answer your key questions about Russian public opinion. I don't think that Russians are gung-ho about the war. I don't think it's a war that Russians would have signed on to on February 23rd, 2022. And of course, Russia is a dictatorship, so people can't go out in the open and sort of work through these issues. But I do think, even beyond the dictatorship that Russia has become, that anti-war sentiment is pretty strong. It's not a war that most Russians want to lose. And that is, to a degree, understandable. In general, countries don't like losing wars and don't wish to lose wars. And so that provides the sufficient bedrock of support for Putin in the sense that people are not going to go out in the streets if they're convinced that Russia really can't lose this war. As for the Russian political elite, I think that there were reservations at the beginning. There was a sense that it was sad that Russia was cutting itself off from Europe and from the West because of the war. There was, I think, fear that Russia was going to lose, and so the elite was, casting around for hedging options and other ways to kind of look beyond a possibly catastrophic war for Russia. That phase is long over. Now the war is a part of the landscape. To be ambitious in Russia and Russian politics is to be pro-war, at least externally pro-war, whatever doubts you might have internally. And there's no way of being a part of the Russian elite now that does not entail overt professions of support for the war. And that might mean you're the director of the Hermitage Museum who has to say that the war is a great idea, or you're in the National Security Council of the Kremlin where you have to say the war is a great idea. Is that sincere? I doubt it. I'm sure that there are a lot of reservations under the surface, but it's sort of a necessary commitment that you have to function in that system. So the elite is co-opted. The population is still sort of there. But again, I would really emphasize this is a variable that could change. And if it were to change, we would have an entirely different war.
I want to ask you a little bit more about one of the predictions you make about kind of a large war in Europe. And I'm wondering if you see that as simply a continuation of this war, or do you see it as an expansion of the current war? Kind of what are the parameters that you see of that?
Well, I don't think Russia is capable of bringing the war to NATO, and some of that came up earlier in our conversation, that Russia does, worry about what it would look like to get into a conflict with NATO. And also, the news at the present moment is not great for Ukraine. It hasn't been for a while. But, Russia is still in the process of many military failures and many military screw-ups. And if that's the case in the eastern portions of Ukraine, how in the world is Russia going to move to Western Ukraine? And how in the world is Russia going to move beyond that to a war with Lithuania or with Poland or other countries that have the NATO nuclear umbrella and other things? Lots of preparation time to get ready for something like that. So, a kind of Nazi scenario where this is, 1938 or 1939, and appeasement means that you're going to have war all across Europe, would I think be a very, very poorly conceived historical analogy. On the other hand, if Russia does somehow win the war, then it does mean that the whole zone of conflict is not going to disappear. It's going to move westward. And that might not mean conventional war, but it's going to be a whole set of anxieties and tensions, a highly militarized border of a kind that would be, in my view, worse, more fluid, more unpredictable, more prone to accident than the Iron Curtain of the Cold War. So you're going to have this kind of vibrating line of insecurity and tension and conflict in Europe. In a way, the question now is how far west is that line going to move? But even if it doesn't look like World War II style campaigns and tank battles and such, it's going to be a deeply unsettling and destabilizing factor in European life. I would say it's already that, given the scale of the war, but it has the potential to move further, to become larger, and to become more sort of pan-European in feeling. But it's not World War II. That's not going to work for us, and it's also not the Cold War. Maybe we need to use these analogies and comparisons to figure out what's novel about this situation. That might be, since we're speaking among students, that might be the kind of thing that students should be, wrestling with at the moment. How we can use analogies to come up with a clear sense of what's strange and new about our moment.
Sorry about that. I'm curious as to what do you think the most likely outcome of the conflict is, and if you don't think kind of total victory and otherwise, what would quote unquote victory look like on, is this a war that's going to end where both sides declare victory and of course there's something different, or is there going to be recognized kind of a victor? It doesn't seem like there's going to be quote unquote total victory by either side. So kind of what does, the kind of settlement, as in most wars end in a settlement of some sort, what kind of settlement do you see as most likely out of that, even if, well, from your previous comments, suggestive there may be some kind of irregular kind of warfare that continues in some way, shape, or form, as has been going on since 2014.
Well, the worst case scenario we touched on with your previous question, which is of the war somehow spreading. And one of the ways that could happen would be through accident. That even though Russia has a fear of NATO, even though President Biden is adamant about not having uniformed American soldiers in Ukraine, in a way, both Putin and Biden have said that they don't want to have World War III. And they have followed up on that with certain actions. But you can say that, and thinking back to the Cold War, you can still get a Cuban Missile Crisis, and you can still get misreadings, misinterpretations. In a way, the First World War with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand is a whole sequential series of misinterpretations, misjudgments, accidents, leading to a kind of spiraling conflict. And that is fully possible at the present stage of this war, and something I think that resembles the kind of worst case scenario for the war. That not because of any one actor's intent, the course of events just takes things in a somewhat uncontrollable direction. But I think the more likely, and by comparison, better case scenario is something that looks like the following, which would not be that Ukraine wins, and it would not be that Russia wins. There's too much of Ukraine for Russia to conquer. Ukraine has been too capable militarily. It's too eager to defend itself, and it has too many backers, even if the US would drop out, for it to be defeatable. And at the same time, it's going to be really, really hard for Ukraine to push the Russian soldiers out. So there will be a line of contact, and there will be something resembling a war for a long time to come. But we might think back to the Cold War in this regard and understand that at the beginning, you have the Berlin crises, and you have the Berlin airlift, and you have, a number of face-offs between the Soviet Union and the US and Europe at the beginning of the Cold War. But what the two powers were able to find, or what the involved powers were able to find, were rules of engagement. So I'm skeptical that diplomats can work out a solution here. In my view, I think Russian motivations vis-a-vis Ukraine are just too radical, they're too extreme, and that we could be as brilliant as possible with our diplomacy, but we're not going to moderate Russia, and we're not going to be able to accommodate its radical designs for Ukraine. But I do think that we can find rules for engagement. And maybe that's happened to a degree already. You haven't seen many Ukrainian strikes in Moscow, which was happening a few months ago. And there might be some things that Russia is not doing that it could be doing, destroying a nuclear power plant, or something as awful as that to contemplate. But there might be things that Russia is not doing. There are definitely things that the US and Russia are not doing in Ukraine for the sake of caution and for the sake of avoiding escalation. So that might be a logic that in a better case scenario would become a little bit infectious. You find rules of engagement, you don't really solve the problem, but you're able to minimize some of its negative effects. And here's where I would want to be most, at least theoretically, optimistic. If that were possible, it would mean for the Ukrainians living on Ukrainian territory not affected directly by the war, that their lives would start to become better because of those rules of engagement. So I do think that we can conceive of the war in those terms. We're not there now, but we can work our way toward that. And that wouldn't end it, but it might make the war, for Ukrainians livable, which is, under the present circumstances, would be a big enough step forward. I don't know if that's optimistic or pessimistic, but to me, it's not bleakly pessimistic.
So we talked a little bit about kind of what's kind of Russian internal politics. How do you see this war playing out within Ukraine itself? Is this, lots of discussions early on around, fascist groups that were, kind of linked to the military and so forth. What do you see this as kind of the legacy in terms of the internal Ukraine polity itself?
I think the news has been quite good in that regard, given what a war is in any country and what the pressures are of wartime. It's not as if you had huge right-wing movements in Ukraine before the war, but they certainly existed, and you can imagine how they would be set off in these circumstances, or you can imagine how you would have big power battles within the government, or military figures emerging, a kind of Napoleon emerging from the military, who might seek to take over the country and drag it in a very different direction. And none of that has come to pass. So it's been, sort of a managed, sort of a fairly well managed war. The complexities are probably more in the nuances. And so you have martial law in Ukraine, and that means that there will not be a presidential election this year, as there would have been had there not been a war. And I would commend to the people listening a new book that's come out by Simon Schuster called The Showman. And it's the first kind of critical biography of Zelensky, or critical take on his time in office, which is useful because he's been put on such a pedestal, and he does have a little bit of an authoritarian tendency. He's squelched media criticism of his government during the war, and he's consolidated a fair amount of media power in the hands of himself and of people in his government. That's, I think, a concern. You don't have elections. You don't have normal politics because of the war. You have a government that has sort of extraordinary powers. I think back to the American Civil War and the suspension of habeas corpus and some things that happened during that war that we still kind of debate and think about 150, 160 years later. And that's what Ukraine is going to have to navigate. Can it really get back to normal constitutional procedures, especially if this is a very long war? That's an open question, and you can't, sort of rush to say that it's all going to be easy and effortless because it won't be. Wars make countries more authoritarian. That, I think, is just a basic axiom, and that's going to be something that's going to have to be handled, dealt with, and worked on. And we don't do Ukraine any favors by romanticizing those questions. They're hard questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation.